I want to welcome everyone to our forum. This is a general meeting of the Marin chapter of the ACLU of Northern California. My name is Frank Shinneman. And the man who has the school and is coming up to our podium. If you're an ACLU member, thank you for your support. If you didn't know that there was an ACLU chapter here in Marin, thanks for discovering us. I want to first introduce other members of our chapter board. A couple are traveling, but please raise your hand or stand up when I call you. Don Carney, Doug Cooper, Lisa Bennett. Thank you very much. We lost one of our board members recently. Dave Curry, who many of you may have known as a passionate advocate for affordable housing, recently passed away and is going to be missed by all of us. And there will be a memorial service, I understand, being scheduled later on in the spring. Before we start, I want to recognize some officials we have in the audience. First of all, any school board members? If you could stand. I guess we didn't get any school board members. How about educators and administrators? I know I saw David Finane here. Fantastic. Thank you very much for coming. Any county supervisors? Well, I think Kate Sears was coming, but I haven't seen her yet, so she's probably trying to find parking. Members of the county justice system. I know there's at least one. Our DA, Lori Frigoli. Since she's in the front row facing forward, no one has to worry because she's not going to see you. Any city council members? Thank you very much. And any members of law enforcement? Thank you very much. Thank you all for your service and for your interest in disrupting Marin's school-to-prison pipeline. ACLU chapters are the eyes and ears of the ACLU in local communities. They're volunteer organizations which the ACLU depends upon to identify local civil liberties issues and provide information on our rights to the community. Restoring justice to the American legal system is a core mission of the ACLU that luckily we're all seeing in the newspaper on almost daily basis. This year our chapter is focusing on understanding and reforming fines and fees in our county. And of course, the other subject is the subject of our panel tonight, disrupting Marin's school-to-prison pipeline. If you're interested in becoming involved in these or other civil liberties issues, please contact us. We're looking for other volunteers to work with us and members of our board. And you can do that at info@marinaclu.org, or if you registered previously or register when you came in with your email address, you'll get an email from us just after this. Now I'd like to introduce Lisa Bennett, who will do a land recognition.
Good evening. My name is Lisa Bennett. I'm with the chapter board here. We're going to start tonight out with what we call a land acknowledgement, and that is a way for us to ground ourselves in time before us and the time right here, and to acknowledge that we are not the only people to ever have lived here. So please sit with your feet flat on the ground. You can close your eyes if you need to. Enter your space thoughtfully. Exhale. Settle in. I'm going to start with a sound. Shh. This is the sound of the wind in the trees and the sound of mothers comforting their children, of those hiding, and of those who want to silence another. Shh. Shh. This land we are on was named Liwan Muloa and Iwu and Awanwiwi, and was the land of the coastal Miwok. Shh. And when you hear the wind in the trees, think of those who first lived here. When you think of mothers, think of these mothers and these fathers, and the silencing we have done to establish that which we stole from the original people. Shh. Shh. We will not be silent. We will not be silent. No more. No more. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. Next, I'd like to introduce our moderator for the evening, Oshala Diane Marcus, also known as Oshala D. She's the director of MC Arts, an intergenerational membership-based group of artists from all disciplines committed to uplifting African arts and culture throughout the world. A working actress, a trained dancer, she is a longtime member of Actors Equity and Screen Actors Guild. Committed to social change, she uses the platform of writing and the stage for spoken word to express herself and amplify the voices of others. She is passionate about assisting the development of emerging artists and cultivating new audiences. A graduate of interdisciplinary studies from California Institute for Integral Studies, her work as a curator, producer of new media, and director of community theater has been exhibited, performed, published, and filmed. Ms. Marcus' many years of experience as a wellness educator and consultant includes gracefully facilitating workshops and moderating conversations on subjects of diversity, equity, inclusion, and healing. And that's what we expect her to do tonight.
And that's what we will be doing tonight. So I wanted to thank you so much, Frank. And so how is everybody doing out there? Kind of just like, you know, just wasn't that a nice acknowledgement and grounding ourselves in just what is? And so tonight I'm very, I'm honored to have been asked to be here to moderate this very important conversation with these three brothers to my left. And so I'm going to introduce them. First of all, on the far left here, we have Jose Varela. Jose has been in the Public Defender's Office for 19 years and ahead of it since 1910. Jose has been a fierce protector of legal rights here.
That's a lot of lost hair.
Uh-oh.
You said
2010. Since 2010. Oh. Okay. Okay. All right. Okay. He has been in the Public Defender's Office for 19 years and the head of it since 1910. Jose has been a fierce protector. Okay, that's what's kind of written down. Ahead of it. And the head of it. Okay, it's just typed wrong. It's okay. Since 2010. So Jose has been a fierce protector of legal rights here and previously in LA and San Diego. So let's give a hand for Jose. Sorry about that, Jose. Dr. Itoko Garcia is the superintendent of the Sausalito Marin City School District. He has been a transformative professional educator for 20 years in some of the most challenged schools in the Bay Area, including Oakland and Hayward, and consulted for 8 other districts in California and Nevada. Dr. Garcia graduated from Tam High School and brings a unique and successful background to this district. Antoine Williams is originally from Los Angeles. He was formerly incarcerated in San Quentin, where he became an actor in their Shakespeare project and was the co-founder and sound designer for the famous Ear Hustle podcast, which I recommend to all of you as a fascinating view into the lives of incarcerated people. Antoine is currently touring schools to deconstruct the school-to-prison pipeline through self-empowerment and active community healing. So before we start this conversation, I want to take a moment to just acknowledge those that we cannot see, those who are locked up right now, those who may be at this moment in solitary confinement, those people who have chains around their neck and chains around their hands and chains around their feet, for all kinds of reasons that they're in there. And the point is that some of them have been in there for 2 years, some of them have been in there for 20 years, some of them have been in for 48 years, 50 years, some of them are in there for life. And it's a huge population. Before we start the conversation, I just want to say that our prison population is right now at about 2.2 million in this state. We lock up based on our position in the world. We lock up about 24% of the prisoners in the world, in the nation. We're right up there with Saudi Arabia, with other places who we think are totalitarian. And that's how I want to really open this up, to remind us of where we're sitting now. Also, I just want to encourage the audience to really ask questions as we go deeper into this conversation. And how many of you have a family member that is in prison right now, or that is in the justice system? Okay. All right. Thank you. All right. All right. Very good. So, school to prison pipeline. What is it? For those of you who don't know what a school to prison pipeline is, this is the first question, the obvious question that I'm going to put out there. What is the school to prison pipeline, and when did it start?
If I may.
Just jump on it. I want to do this as an informal, chop it up conversation.
Sounds good. So I taught kindergarten for a long time, and one of the anecdotes that I use all the time is that kindergarten is like launching a rocket to the moon. If you get a few degrees off at the start, you never hit the moon. If you get a few degrees off later in your journey, you might not hit exactly where you were aiming, but you still hit the moon. And the reality is that the school to prison pipeline starts even before kindergarten. 80% of kids that graduate on grade level in kindergarten attend four-year universities. 80% of kids do not. Most don't even graduate high school. And you begin to see the correlation right there. And so really what we're talking about begins in pre-kindergarten. It sometimes even begins prenatally for some students. The gap in opportunity, the gap in effect happens that early. And I'm excited about some of the changes to Ed Code and state law that say that we can no longer suspend kids for defiance and disrespect. If I asked each one of you in this room right now how you define defiance or disrespect, we'd probably have 35 or 50 different answers. And so you can imagine what kind of a qualitative judgment that is between teachers and students. And we can now no longer do that in our education system. But for decades and for generations, I see two guys that I grew up with right around here, out here in the audience. Thank y'all for being here. But there should be a lot more of us here. And a lot of us are gone. A lot of us are in the pen with an L. A lot of us are dead. A lot of us are strung out on drugs. And a lot of that happened around what happened in our very early childhood. And so I've deferred to the other two gentlemen to kind of add to that. But from my standpoint, this starts from almost the very beginning of our lives, and how the kinds of opportunities that our families have, the kinds of economic opportunities, the kinds of housing opportunities, the kind of opportunities, access to healthcare and things of that nature, really set us often on a track, one or the other. Now, it's not fatalistic, it's not deterministic. You can do things to break that and change your outcomes. But when we talk about the school to prison pipeline, that's how early it starts, in my opinion.
Okay, so okay, go on.
I think that one of the things that happens, and I think Dr. Garcia was sort of focusing a little bit on that, and that is how soon do our children get into systems? And what is systems? What am I talking about, right? I'm talking about even as young as kindergarten or in preschool, children are systematically graded. They're cooperative, they're not cooperative, they're disruptive, they're that. All of a sudden, at that point in time, definitions are given to our children. at that very young age. And all of a sudden, they're systematically put into this. And you see it from the kindergarten teacher to the first grade. He's a disruptive little boy. You're really going to have to stay on top of him. You know, and all of a sudden, those qualities continue to be passed on to the next teacher, to the next teacher. And systematically, that child then potentially goes through the suspension process, and eventually the expulsion process, or they make it easy. They just drop out, okay? And so that system works in that way. Along with those systems, believe it or not, oftentimes are child protective systems that come into the family that cause issues with regard to that. There are systems of healthcare that do not provide necessary medical care or nutrition in order to deal with that child. And these systems start adding up. They start literally creating the equation that by the time some of these children are in the 4th and 5th grade, they literally are on their way to criminality because they are starting the process, because another system oftentimes comes into play, and that's the system of the streets, okay? The reality is the system of the streets takes over. And in jurisdictions where I worked in San Diego, Los Angeles, for us, it literally was, are you blue, are you red, what are you repping, well, what's your hood, what's this, where are you from was not a question for location. It really was a question of allegiance. And so these systems start coming into these children's lives at such an early age that by the time some of them are in high school, they literally are either, completely separated from the educational system and on the streets, or in some way finding themselves to the pathway that eventually gets them into state prison. And so these systems are really important for us to be aware of, right? We need to have this cultural competence in teachers and administrators and others, Oh, we need to get the police in here and get them into juvenile hall. We need to do the following things. And we have some folks here from the probation department, and later I'll talk about some of the great work they're doing to disrupt the pipeline. But when we talk about disrupting the pipeline, we're talking about disrupting it at these initial systematic defining places way at the start. Because if we don't, they get passed on too quickly. And then that process of social history that basically imprisons these children from opportunities that might otherwise be available. I see a bunch of folks out here who do great work in the legal field. Frank is here, who does death penalty work and everything else like that. We see at the tail end the reality of all this, when we have to do the social histories, and we literally go back, and Dr. Garcia is right, we go back to the womb, and oftentimes we find some of those things there. And so as we talk about these things and we talk about steps to address them, we have to talk about disrupting the systems, because it's not one pipeline. It'd be great if it was just one pipeline, but the reality, it's a lot of plumbing that creates this pipeline.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Jose.
I feel that it is really important to understand that the school-to-prison pipeline is a construct. I think we all should first and foremost understand that the school-to-prison pipeline is a construct, right? And this construct, like they were saying, it doesn't necessarily come from schools. It comes from us as adults, what we think is right and wrong, right? And our children are byproducts of what we think and what we do and what we teach. So when our children go into schools, they go representing us. They go mirroring everything that they see in the household. Now, whether or not your household is more conservative or liberal, when your children step into schools, right, they're stepping into, again, a system that is constructed by somebody else's views on what the world should be like. And then we start at such an early age where we think children, again, are destructive, and we think children need to be disciplined when their life doesn't mirror what we're used to. So you get a lot of teachers and educators and people of influence that go directly into communities that they are not familiar with, and all you see is what's wrong because it's not what you're used to. So the school to prison pipeline is a result of how all of us, have decided people should be treated. We have all signed these laws that made it okay for the 3 strikes, that has made it okay to sentence 14-year-old children to life inside of prison. We all have signed that. So when I think about the school to prison pipeline, I think about all of our mindsets, and in such a day and age where we didn't think for ourselves and we allowed whatever the system to tell us is right and wrong, we just accepted it. And then when you get, when children go home with reports saying that you're destructive or you're disruptive, us as parents, we automatically go in on the child, right? Because we expect them to be right for others and not right for themselves. And then even in that, we're automatically teaching our children to be obedient to the rights and wrongs of somebody else, preparing them to get stripped butt naked, preparing them to walk into a jail where you're going to have to do everything that you've been doing in your household, get yelled at, get put in timeout, where you're going to get hit if you don't do what's right. Right? So when I really think of the school to prison pipeline, I think it is a direct result of everything that we didn't do in the moments we were supposed to act more as individuals. When we were supposed to say, this is what's right for us to heal. This is how we come together. This is how I teach you and I show you love. And yet, we never did it.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. That was powerful, man. I kind of want to tie a couple of things together that these brothers both offered. One, the idea or the theory of structural racism. John A. Powell and Grant Thomas's theory of structural racism suggests that the predictable and historically durable outcomes that we see for many communities, low-income communities, communities of color, are due to the interaction of multiple individual systems. Right? And so everybody is pretty well versed in the idea of institutional racism. But structural racism says basically you don't need an individual actor, you don't need a face, but the way that the school system and the criminal justice system and the health system and the mortgage lending system and all these other systems work together create these outcomes for certain groups of people in our society. And just to add on to what you were saying, we do condition ourselves. We condition ourselves based on culture. We condition ourselves based on language. We condition ourselves based on all these things and then send our babies to school. And often our babies are met with deficit thinking, with low expectations, and with a rejection of who they are, who their cultural and linguistic identity is, that immediately feeds back the circle that you just raised up. So thank you for saying that.
Yeah, thank you all. I want to bring up this whole, first of all, when I hear the term school to prison pipeline, those two words really shouldn't be in the same sentence. And so the question what really comes up for me is I'm really glad that you brought up 3 strikes, you're out. And we talked about this before, Jose, the 3 strikes, you're out laws. How did this prison, who created the school to prison pipeline? And who is it really affecting? So we know that it affects mostly black young men who 1 in 3 are between the ages of 18 and 35, between 1 and 3. 1 in 3 young black men between the ages of 18 and 30 are in the prison system, within the judicial system. Young black girls, that's the next figure that's climbing. Native American children are also disproportionately represented in this school to prison pipeline. And so the whole idea of the structural part of it, when did it start? How was it built? I want us to spend a little time on that, the history of kind of where we got to.
Well, yes. Allow me to correct a perception for the audience.
Yes.
It actually has been designed almost from the very inception of schooling in the United States of America. Thomas Jefferson said when he advocated the creation of a public school system, he advocated the creation of a two-track public school system, one for the learned and one for the laboring. And the track for the laboring was designed, and I quote Thomas Jefferson, to rake a few geniuses for the rubbish. Within 100 years of the start of public school in what we now know as New England, the first juvenile reform school was started. And so actually since the very beginning of public school in our country, this idea of a blending of schooling and juvenile justice, juvenile reform has been at the heart of our school system. Not to mention the way that the Bureau of Indian Affairs used boarding schools to recondition and erase Native American people's culture and language. You know, really it is woven into the fabric of both school and criminal justice. You might even argue that it was woven into the school system for children that couldn't conform far earlier than the criminal justice system. We've only had a penal system in this country since 1973. It was rehabilitative. If you made it, you had a chance to get out. But school essentially has always been designed to funnel non-compliant people, not docile people, into a different system.
So are the public school systems serving black and brown children? If the statistics say that when you go into school, you're going into a pipeline where if you're of African descent, if you are of Native American descent, that your chances of you going into that school mean that you're going into a prison system. That's really what it's saying. Is it that the system has failed our children, or was the system designed, as you're saying? And that's the question. Is the system itself designed?
The system failed our children. There is just no question about it. The prison pipeline during the 3 strikes was basically a prison guard union lifetime guarantee of work. I mean, it just opened the faucet to bring in people that were going to keep prisons open, and were going to continually create private prisons, you know, create other ways to sort of house people at a profit. People saw this as a profitable way to put people away, and they failed the school system. And how many of you had a teacher that really was a bad teacher? I saw many teachers when I was growing up that were really bad human beings. They hit children. I mean, literally as a kid, I used to have my name on many paddles that were used on me, right? Because I always talked back, right? And so the reality is I knew corporal punishment, man. You know, I was aware of it, right? And thank God in the 6th grade, in the 4th grade, I met a wonderful teacher. You know, before that, every teacher thought that the back of my hand was where their hand landed, you know? And the reality, it was in the 4th grade, I finally met a teacher that literally took me aside and said, you know what? You're a smart little guy. I just need you to sit still. And she said, what I want you to do is, can you do me a favor? Can you sit on your hands in class? And just let's play a game. How long can you sit on your hands? And next thing I know, I'm sitting on my hands. And I thought, oh, you know, this lady actually taught me something. And then all of a sudden through the school year, she says, you know, keep going. You can do your homework. And all of a sudden, I'm getting, instead of the N's need to improve and the S's that I strove for, all of a sudden I saw an E on an E. What the hell is this? That doesn't happen to me, right? But it was this teacher who motivated and who cared and who was really concerned. And at the end of the year, she says, you know, we have a program here in Long Beach for kids that we see doing well in school, and you're going to get to go to summer school. And guess what? At the end of summer school, you will get to go to camp for 1 week. You know what that's like to a poor kid? Are you kidding me? I get to go, and literally every week we went on field trips. They took us to visit professionals. They did all this, and that was the start. You know, I thought for the longest time in the 4th, 5th grade, I wanted to be a tugboat captain, because we had gone on a tugboat in the Los Angeles harbor, okay? And I said, I'm gonna be a tugboat captain. Instead, I started just looking like a tugboat, right? But the reality was, the reality was, when you find good teachers, they are blessed. They are blessed, wonderful things. And that's really where we started seeing it, because it was the 60s, believe it or not, that brought those good teachers into the process, right? It was the Peace Corps folks that came back to teach and had world experience of what they had seen. All of a sudden, we started seeing new ways of teaching. And education is a political ping pong. One day it's teaching to empower a child, the next it's back to basics, and I feel sorry for educators because they're constantly being back and forth. But in the end, where we started seeing successes was in this model of motivation that really started helping children, right? I heard from probation, Eric Olson, of a program that they're starting to work with young kids called School Works. That is to say, School Works, right? And so they were starting to find these children that were having that disruptive label put on them and starting to wrap around them with services, literally wrap around them with services, and not through probation, not through probation.
So Jose, we're going to get to that when we start kind of talking about some solution-oriented things to this. I still want to stay on this whole, that the school itself being that you're entering into it's good that individual teachers come into the system, and that's great. But we're talking about a system. We're talking about a system that no matter how many individual teachers there are that are good in there, and that's great. The system itself is a pipeline. SARB, SARB, are you familiar with that? School Attendance Review Board?
Yes, we have an attorney that actually goes to the SARB boards.
Okay, so when I heard about SARB, School Attendance Review Board, how many in the audience have heard of Student Attendance Review Board? Okay, so Student Attendance Review Board, I believe there's someone from law enforcement on that. There's someone from the school. Are there any parents? Are there any therapists on the board? This is specifically around attendance, truancy. Can we talk a little bit about that? And is there enough representation from students themselves on this board? And is it actually serving the students, or who is it actually serving? So
it's interesting. It's a little bit of a misnomer. You hear the name Student Attendance Review Board and you think of a board full of people, but it's really often a representative from the district attorney's office, a judge, the parent, the child, and a representative from the school that really actually goes to court and goes to a hearing. You know, there are a lot of really progressive things that are happening in this arena and all over the state and here in our county, and it's actually not easy to get to a SARB hearing. Most schools do a lot of things to kind of try to avoid it as much as we can, because we don't want to criminalize our parents for not being able to get their kids to school. But at the end of the day, it is really related to truancy laws that have been on the books since the 1800s that were designed to support compulsory education. And that starts in first grade. You can be started in SARB as early as first grade. Kindergarten in the state of California is the only grade that's not compulsory.
And as a result of some of the consequences that can happen at a SARB board, the legislature a few years ago mandated the public defenders be at SARB boards in order to be able to represent family members, because oftentimes there were underlying circumstances that caused a child to not go to school. You know, sometimes it was because their parents feared that the child might be, caught up in immigration raid, or they were just scared through fear going through the county. Other times, kids were bullied through school, and so when stuff like that started coming out, with advocacy, the SARB board started to become, as Dr. Garcia said, they're starting to look at these things in a much more holistic way. It used to be simply a numbers. You missed this many classes, you missed this many classes again, we're going to suspend you. You missed these many classes again, you're expelled, right? And then all of a sudden there's the family looking for another school district that will give the kid a chance, right? And so before, SARB boards were really intense. The other thing that sometimes happens in SAR boards is that we come to find out that the children need an individual education plan, an IEP, that they have special learning needs that keep them from attending school because they're dyslexic, they have issues of ADHD, there's other things of that nature. And oftentimes those are tough because those things cost school districts money. And so the advocacy that oftentimes is now promoted by my office and others is to find these holistic solutions. That is to say, what services are necessary in order to be able to ensure the child is in school, because it is true, school works. The reality is the more we can keep kids engaged in school, the more the other pipelines don't get them. And that is to say, we can actually get them into programs that allow them to have successful and good and decent lives. And so the goal is to say school works. I hesitate to say that school is the pipeline to the prison pipeline. It is definitely one of the pipelines in those kids that are lost in the clog.
So I have to jump in real quick, because I feel like there's a big difference between having an education and being educated. Mm-hmm. And teachers, I feel, should be experts in human development. Right? There's a difference between having a student who can regurgitate anything that's put before them. Right? Like there's a bunch of people that can do that. Mm-hmm. But life doesn't require, a successful life outside of school doesn't require something to just be regurgitated. Right? Being educated is having the tools and knowing how to navigate and knowing what's right and wrong when life hits you with different scenarios, right? So when I can't say that to keep kids in school will keep kids out of prison. I think to keep kids in healthy environments. Now, if their school is a healthy environment where they develop better as humans, then prison becomes obsolete.
And I think that's the goal. The goal is to get exactly where I say, where schools are nurturing places where children want to go. That's really and the reality is it means breaking the paradigms of how schools are run now. That is to say, more and more children are wanting, for example, internships. I see people from the community school here. I see people from probation. We're trying to get kids, and Ken Lippy, who's here from the school to career program. The goal is to get people that non-traditional education that gives them the skills and the self-esteem to go on to do really wonderful things. So you're right. If school is that traditional Thomas Jefferson model, it is a prison. You may as well call that.
And absolutely the antidote to deficit thinking and low expectations and rejection of a child's culture and language is absolutely high expectations, asset-based lens, cultural and linguistic affirmation, care, love. We're so scared to say the word love. But the best way to interrupt the school to prison pipeline is to make sure that schools are caring, loving places.
Thank you. I want to ask a question. Thank you. Yes. Who is safer? So if we're saying, because I'm staying with the subject of school to prison pipeline, who is made safer in this system? Like who is it designed for? Because I'm assuming that these children that are being truant, or they come into these systems or the school system where they're being punished for this and this and that. I mean, punishment, that's one thing. You're being punished for being tardy. And then that puts you somehow into a track that leads you toward a judicial system. What Dr. Garcia was saying is great, because we're looking at alternatives, and I think we're going to talk a little bit more about that, and the audience will be able to speak more on what other alternatives are there. We have this assumption that you go into school, if there's disruptive behavior, whatever that means, that if you keep doing it, that you're eventually going to end up in this pipeline. And my question is that inevitable? I mean, why is there a pipeline? Let me frame the question a little differently. It is historical. This is nothing new. We've seen children being used, poor children, children that don't have opportunities that put them into a higher echelon of society in other countries throughout time, feudal Europe, before the French Revolution. The powers that be mowed children out of the street. There was paupers prisons. All kinds of reasons to take the poor and to lock them up so that they could do free labor. And if we're talking about free labor, that's very insidious. And yet when we think about these systems, we think of totalitarian systems that do this. We don't think that a democracy does this. And yet, here we are, a democracy, and we're doing that. And as a population, as a public, this is our public school system. And so that seems very insidious. Is there a way to actually, how can we disrupt it if it's part of the system itself?
Well, I'll tell you, I'll let Dr. Garcia start talking about, you disrupt it by disrupting it, okay? And I'll give you an example of how you disrupt it, and I think Antoine is absolutely right. There are linear kids that if they know how to review, repeat, and rinse again, they know how to get through school. And they know how to get to an Ivy League school, and they know how to do all that linear work that has been laid before them. The child of trauma is a butterfly trying to just find some place to be able to go to where they're going through. I'll give you an example of how learning has got to become different, and that learning that appreciates the reality of lived experience, right? I have an internship program where I bring in high school students, and I send them down to the courtroom to observe what's going on in the courtroom. And the linear kids from TAM, from Marin Academy, I send them down and said, what did you see? Well, I saw the judge, and the judge was really very formal and really did a very good job of keeping the courtroom in order and did this and that and very good. And then I have kids who are dealing with issues at school, and some of them come from community school, or they come from other places where they've got challenges that they're working on, and these kids fidget. They sit there and they fidget. And I said, what's going on? Oh, you don't want to know what's going on, Mr. Rowe. No, tell me, what's going on? Isn't that what you saw? That's not what I saw, Mr. Rowe. I said, well, why don't you tell everybody what you saw? Nah, people get mad. I said, no, tell people what you saw. And all of a sudden the kid will say, well, I looked over there and the judge was just looking at his computer, wasn't listening to the lawyer at all. I saw the client pulling at the lawyer's arm, and the lawyer was just kind of talking and not even paying attention to his client. I saw everybody else walking around. I just saw a poor guy trying to hold on is what I saw, right? And I look at the linear kids and I said, you got a lot to learn from him. You got a lot to learn from him. And it's that ability to bring in that non-traditional lived experience that is essential to appreciating these children's ability. We love children and we love other human beings when we acknowledge their presence and their history and their insights, right? And it's only when you create these learning environments that appreciate difference and diversity in that way that you realize in the end you take the linear kid and make him wiser, and you take the non-linear kid and make him wiser or her wiser in that connection. So this notion of what the school has done by tracking people into, you're the linear kid who's always going to go here, you, the rest of you, we just got to get you through. And then if we get you through, maybe you'll get a job. If not, the prison system will take care of you, And that's the issue, is the restructuring of education to be a place of appreciation, and we have to work at that.
So there's something that I realized maybe 4 years before my release. For the world to be governed by law, it's the one thing that isn't taught in public schools. So I think a great tool that can be used to deconstruct the school-to-prison pipeline is teach basic law. Because in my community, right, and I come from South Central Los Angeles, Well, I automatically thought if you go to jail the first time, you get 6 months. I didn't know everything you do in the commission of a crime is another crime, right? But this is all like, it's all public knowledge, right? Like, you can go look this up. But when our students don't understand that a strong arm robbery opposed to robbery with a weapon is a difference between 6 months and 15 years. And then they don't understand that if you punch somebody in the commission of a robbery or just a fight, like that's an assault, that's 5 years. And if you threaten them just out of pure, right, like just pure anger, that's another. And what kind of gun you have, that's another 10, 15, or life sentence. They don't know if you move somebody from 6 feet, it's kidnapping. That carries a life sentence, right? So when we think about the prison system and how people are continuously being swept in, it's among opportunity, right? It's among spatial and linear thinking. It's also comes down to, again, what information and what opportunity is presented to help people grow in a conscious way. And real quick, I can say this. If I knew everything that came with the law, my choices would have been different. A lot of my choices would have been different.
And I think that every school should have an Antoine teaching, okay? And I'll give you an example. My friend Oscar Curry is here. And Oscar Curry spent, 18 years? Under 3 strikes. 3 strikes. And we were able to get him out when the reform came under Prop 36. And I have hired him to come to my office and teach exactly what you're talking about, Antoine, through lived experience. You know. So the goal is to get. And the thing that we find from law students to high school students to junior high students that work with Oscar, it's real. Everything Antoine says is real. And there is no teacher that can teach from non-lived experience. There's something about lived experience that's so important. And I think that one of the ways we disrupt the prison pipeline is to have those who have been through it and wish to disrupt it in this educational system.
Thank you. So I'm glad you said that. So I want to just put out a couple more statistics. We are going to open it up to the audience in just a few moments. But I do want to add to this conversation the concept of the reality of race. When we look at public schools, I would say, and I'm not sure, so I don't like to quote exact statistics because I don't want to quote the wrong statistic, but let's just say a majority of teachers in our inner city schools are white women. And we're talking about educating.
80%.
Is it 80%? So I didn't want to say it. It was in my mind, but I didn't want to misquote. So if we're talking about 80% of white women are the teachers of young black men, Latino men, girls, completely different lived experience, maybe wonderful, great intentions. And we're talking about the notion of feeling safe. And we know the history of, the history around racism in this country, especially around white women, black men, brown men. That is very much in there. And so that's another element when we talk about disrupting the system is why are there, we can't separate the system from that. Don't we have more teachers of color?
That hood PhD that Antoine and Oscar are talking about is critical, right, when you're dealing with high trauma kids. But I also, want to be very clear, like I don't believe that anything's fatalistic, right? Like, just because you have come from a low-income background or you had high trauma or you've been around all kind of violence doesn't mean necessarily that's your destiny, right? It just means that's a likely outcome, right? But we can't let our trauma define us. And, you know, I mean, there's a whole bunch of reasons why white women are still the majority of teachers. But if you look, first of all, you know, the one-room schoolhouse that the American school system is built on was usually staffed by a woman. Later, fast forward to the 20th century, it was one of the only acceptable jobs for women was to be a teacher, right? And so if you look at rates of college acceptance historically and who was able to go to college, you can start to see the foundation of this pattern in our system. And I think, you know, to your point, Oscar, a lot of what feeds the school to prison pipeline is kids don't even understand the expectations in school. Mm-hmm. And that's how they get into trouble around behavior. Because we have different cultural expectations, and the cultural expectations of how to behave in school are based on white cultural norms. And so when you have Black and Latino kids show up and be themselves, they immediately are identified as troublemakers, right? And so to Jose's point, you know, one of the ways that we can begin, and one of the ways that I have seen schools successfully transform is to really look at systems of behavior management, systems of, I don't even like to use the word discipline, right? I would even offer to look at systems of school culture and climate. If you walk around this school, you can see one little poster over there, but you can see some evidence of that here at Bayside MLK. There's a system that we use called positive behavior intervention systems, and it rests entirely on the idea that all behavior management is tied to positive behavior expectations. So that's one way to undo deficit thinking and low expectations, is that when I, as an adult who has power in the situation, has an interaction with a young person, that I always frame that around a positive expectation. And, you know, recruiting teachers of color, the reality is, because of those historically durable patterns that I talked about when we started, you're more likely to find teachers of color that have a valid teaching credential and a hood PhD than you are to find white teachers that have that experience. Now, not to say, I know some white teachers with hood PhDs too. It's not trying to rule anybody out, but you're more likely to find Black and Latino and people from the res that have that kind of experience and can be that kind of guidance, can understand the way that kids are showing up, and sometimes parents are showing up culturally and linguistically, because that's the other way schools feed the school to prison pipeline, is when parents come in upset, first call, police, right? Instead of, hey, let me sit down, let me talk to you, let me see what's going on with you, let me see how let me try to listen to you and understand you, and maybe we can get to a place of a little bit more calm communication, right? And so along with school culture and climate, along with recruiting teachers of color, you know, doing a lot of internal work, a lot of deep reflection on where our positionality lies, what is the power dynamics that we hold with our students. I can't even take credit for this, but prior to my hiring, this district decided to contract with an organization called Courageous Conversation. And we trained our whole staff on courageous conversations about race prior to the school year. Teachers, custodians, you know, student success coaches, right? It's all a system. We can't put it all on teachers. We can't put it all on principals. The way the food service staff works, the way the custodians work is all related, and we all have to be working together to create affirming, validating, caring experience for our kids and families if we want them to have different outcomes.
Yes, thank you. Right. And Dr. Garcia, it's great to see someone in your position of power within the system that has a different view. We don't often see that view within our communities, really coming from that place. There's a movement out in the country where the boarding school model has changed where more Native American children are now going to schools where they're able to learn their own language, where before it was denied for them to learn their own language. More African children of African descent are going into private schools, and I will say that those schools, there's no school to prison pipeline. That's not what it's about. And so what we're talking about is our public schools. So if our public schools are a school to prison pipeline, and prisons have become more of a labor, let's just face it, 74 cents a day some prisoners are making, right?
Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow has a very fascinating statistic. If you haven't read that book, you should read her, at least watch her TED Talk. It's only like 25 minutes long.
How many have read Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow? Okay, well.
Right, but she says we now have in our carceral system people doing labor at this rate, more people than were ever enslaved at any one time under slavery in the United States of America. And so if you want to look, I mean, it is free labor. It's been free labor. That's what it's about.
It's how the country was founded. And so the question, and I'll put this out here so we can continue to talk about it, is given that our public school system is a pipeline to prison, again, it's great we have Dr. Garcia, but is there any, I mean, a lot of parents, you know, they're sending their children to school because they have to, but are schools really safe for Black and brown and Native American children? That's a question. Are they safe places? Even with good teachers here and there, how long is it going to take us to fill our schools with proportionately numbers of Black and brown teachers, Native American teachers, not just for the Black and brown and Native American and increasing immigrant populations that are coming in from all around the world so they get to know the true history of this country. How long will that take? And in the meantime, we keep losing a generation after generation after generation. The school to prison pipeline, Jose, you were talking about 3 strikes you're out, kind of came in line with the 3 strikes you're out came kind of around the crack epidemic. And I grew up seeing the crack epidemic, and the crack epidemic was very structurally based in our system. How many generations can we afford?
It depends on the principal, depends on the superintendent, depends on the school board. There's 1,300 school districts in the state of California. 1,300 superintendents. Less than 100 are people of color, right? So, I mean, in some senses, the question really has to go back to who do we vote for? Who's hiring? One thing I say when I present to principals all the time is, you want diversity on your staff? You're the hiring manager. It's you. It's not some outside mythical person. Like, you have to make a commitment to do that. I increased the teachers of color on my staff in 5 years, on a staff of 35 teachers, from 5 to 17, right? It's possible to do this, but we actually have to have a commitment to do it. We have to have a community commitment to elect people that will select school leaders that have a commitment to do that, and then we have to cultivate school leaders that have the same commitment to that, and other community leaders, right? The community school model is another really important thing where, you know, it used to be, we used to talk about wraparound services. I really push for the integration of services. How do these become the fabric and the culture of the school? How does a social worker in the schoolhouse become part of every school that serves communities that need support, and not in a way to funnel kids and families to the criminal justice system, but in a way to make sure that they have the social services that they need so they can thrive.
And I always tell people, the 3-strike law stole from those generations the schools that should have been built instead of the prisons.
Yep.
You know, when I was trained by restorative justice advocates when AB 109 and some of these other programs were coming in, as the prison was going to have to depopulate because of some federal lawsuits. And very interestingly, we had an old judge from Texas come in. And I thought, what is this guy going to teach us, right? And he got up there and he said, you know, I used to be lock them up, lock them up, lock them up. And then all of a sudden, somebody told me what I was really doing to my community. Because when you create a prison, you create a prison parolee population. And when you create a prison parolee population that has this much opportunity to be able to get jobs, to do everything, all you've done is created a criminal enterprise within your own community. Jerry Brown learned that in Oakland when he was the Oakland city mayor, the mayor of Oakland. When he came back a second time as governor, he realized he needed to change the laws to cure that mess that he had created, right? But one of the things that this judge from Texas said, you know, the proudest moment I had was when we closed a prison and opened 3 elementary schools. The reality is, the things we're talking about, the care for children that we're talking about, is that we should be building schools that allow teachers to have class sizes that allow them to interact with children in a way that makes children feel as if though school is a safe place, that school is a place where their own potential becomes evident to them in a way that charms and entices them and motivates them, right? So the pipeline is this. There's school and then there's prison. We need to do something with the prison so that we get more nutrients and water to the schools in order to be able to do that, right? I will tell you, restorative justice is starting to come into schools. It's starting to look at suspensions very differently. It's starting to make schools safer for kids because they're not going to be suspended. The goal is to keep them in school and see how they can do it. And having their classmates create sentences that are humane. I'm going to tell you, Don Carney is here with youth court. And some of the sentences that these youth court jurors and advocates create are so humane. It's amazing to me, right? In such a way that the person who is being given a sentence not only completes the sentence, but then wants to come back and be a member of the youth court. That's really that process that you want to have happen with regard to safe places. But again, it's going to, you know, we owe to this generation the force of restorative justice, alternatives to jail, and the ability to really want to raise them in an environment where they can create and be who they want to be and make this world a better place.
Prison beds are still built from 3rd grade literacy scores in our state. Today, been true since. The number of projected prison beds that are built, the number of new prison construction beds are based every year on 3rd grade literacy scores. It's been true since the 80s. It hasn't stopped.
One of the things that really stands out for me is our society has always been driven by fear.
Amen.
And when you think about, I'm not sure if everybody's like really familiar with this, but before the 3 strikes law, there was the Habitual Criminal Act. And that was 3 strikes. If you commit the same crime 3 times, you're done with. When 3 strikes was created, that was a political move. And it was created I don't want to say like because of Mark Class. Like, we have a father who lost his daughter tragically, and he wants justice and he wants safety. And somebody's seen his trauma, his experience, as a way to capitalize and instill fear in people whose daughters and children look like that. And that fear created the 3 strikes, but the 3 strikes wasn't utilized in the ways that it was supposed to be. So if fear is always going to be the driving force behind our community and behind the development of our country, then we will always have something that gets slammed in the face of people that don't deserve it. And be it children, be it communities, we start to internalize and we start to implicitly apply pressure to people that we don't really have to, right? We think super predator, titles and labels, right? Something that just in something inside you is shaking when you hear it. And then that become the thing that makes it easy and okay to incarcerate children at a much younger age. The youngest person I've ever come across inside of prison doing a life sentence was 14 years old. So for everybody in here that has a son, a daughter, a niece, a nephew, this system is self-sustaining. It doesn't care if you're black or if you're white. It doesn't care if you're Hispanic. This is the law. And as soon as you cross it, you're subject. You're subject to the same mistreatment. You're subject to the same kind of isolation and being dehumanized as so many other cultures and communities have dealt with for the last 30 years. So again, if it's not going to be fear that like keeps us, like I'm afraid of the system so I don't want to get into it, we have to acknowledge it. We've been driven by fear our entire life. People go to church because they're afraid of God, or they're afraid to go to hell, right? Fear can't be the driving force in changing a system or a community. It has to be a unity, right? And understanding like our true value. And when we see people and children as children and not monsters because their lifestyle doesn't look like ours, or because they can't sit down and listen for longer than 5 minutes, if we can't see that as a way of us already being conditioned to send people, young men, young women, right? Us as educators, us as adults, we have a huge responsibility, and we've been slacking off. We could blame it on a whole bunch of things, but when it comes down to it, we voted on these laws. It's so much policy making that we have control over that can change the dynamic of how children are treated, how people are sentenced, who comes home, who spends enough time in prison and who doesn't. So if we're going to deconstruct this, we got to start deconstructing our mindset, our conditioning, right? How we see people. I walked through a school that I've been working in collaborations with for like at least 2 months, and I had 5 people stare at me like, what am I doing here? And I'm like, some things never change. Some things will never change.
To your point, the population of students that are most suspended nationally, African American females.
Yes.
Dress code violations, right? Our society hypersexualizes young black girls, hyper-criminalizes or makes hyper-aggressive young black males. The perception of Latino males and females isn't really that much different, right? And so immediately we have a social conditioning to look at groups of people with fear and with suspicion, right? And that really makes a difference on how we interact with people. And it is a very deep reflection that we're inviting everybody to engage in around, hey, what is it that you immediately feel? What is it that you immediately think when you see these groups of people walking down the street or walking in your neighborhood?
Or walking behind you while you have your bag. I mean, it's insidious, and it is deep, and it is something to reflect on. Before we move on to audience questions, because there's some real good questions here. Speaking of fear, there was an incident at Tam High today, which is right here in Mill Valley, right? Where there was a gun. I heard 3 different stories already, so I'm not sure exactly what happened. But what I want to say about it is that what came to my mind is like, well, there's another gun incident in the suburbs. And yet those schools are not highly policed. I was at a school in West Oakland, and I literally saw a law enforcement, placard on the front of the school. Like the law enforcement and the school were hand in hand, like you're walking into a jail cell. And yet, if the statistics, and we're talking, Antoine, you're talking about crossing that line of who gets in. Yeah, once you get into the prison system, you're in. Doesn't matter who you are. But who gets in is another story. And as many killings, mass shootings, terrorist acts that have happened with young white males, young white males still aren't in our society looked upon as the ones that are going to most make you afraid. And so oftentimes when I'm hearing Antoine and others speak, because again, I feel like I'm moderating, but I'm also speaking for a lot of people that I know that have been locked up. Because if you're African American and you've grown up in the hood or even in the suburb, when someone says, how many people do you know in your family locked up, you can usually put it on one hand or more. And that's not to say that your family's criminal. It's just that this is within the system that we live in.
You know, one of the saddest things that I have to do in my career, because it is teaching, I created a pamphlet called Creating an Exit Plan Out of the Criminal Justice System. And it's a pamphlet that I brought to Marin City, and a lot of the grandparents really got it. And the thing that I find difficult about the pamphlet and teaching it is that I'm basically telling people how to act undercover. You know, I'm really having to teach people, you know, the reality of how you get through the criminal justice system. You know, you make sure you don't miss a probation appointment. You make sure that you work well with your probation officers. You make sure that you work with your lawyers. You do this. And I have 2 P's. I said, these 2 P's are going to be the hardest ones for you. Like I said, they were hard for me. But if you want to get an exit plan out of it, one is, people are going to say, I can't. Politeness is power is one mantra. The other one is patience is power. I've used it, and one of the things I'm telling people is I need you to fake it till you make it out, okay? I need you to go through this process, right? And one of the things that winds up is, you know, I'll be honest with you, I used to do this program with my clients who were incarcerated. And I would say, look, if we're going to get you out, I need you to be able to do this. Try politeness is power. And it was very amazing. It was interesting to me. They said, oh, Mr. I said, look, man, today when you come into court, just try it as soon as you get up. And all of a sudden, I would get the person, Mr. Varela, it worked. It worked. It worked. I got 2 bologna sandwiches today for lunch. We're only supposed to get 1. Or all of a sudden, I would tell my client, remember, we're going to go to trial. Politeness is power. And also my client would say thank you to everybody on his path that morning. He'd get to court, and all of a sudden, I'd hear the bailiff say, hey, what's this guy charged with? He's a really good guy. And all of a sudden, the bailiff would tell the clerk, hey, this guy's a good guy, right? I said, remember, ask for everything. If you need water, just say, Mr. Vella, may I have water? And then ask the bailiff, may I pour water? I said, just watch the way the system works in this way, right? And then all of a sudden, the bailiff, the clerk goes in back to the judge and says, hey, this guy's a really nice guy. He's really polite. And all of a sudden, the judge comes out and says, how you doing today, Mr. Whatever it is? And my client's going, oh my God. I teach my clients to pay attention by following the voice in the courtroom. Just follow the voice. Follow the voice. I have won trials based on that because jurors have said, your client was so attentive throughout the trial, right? Things of that nature. But one of the things that hurts me is I have to tell them, you have to stop being who you are. And in some ways it's good, but at the same time, it's once again, you know, this control component and how is it that it works and doesn't work and how does it play out? And so to me, I think that you know, the ability for somebody to be able to express, to be themselves, and for somebody to look at it and say, that person's just emoting in a way that they emote.
But by the time, and I appreciate that story, because you're right, once they're in your system, once they're over there on that side, they have to comply. They better know how to act. What we're talking about in deconstructing the system right now is for them never to get over there. As much as I know that's your job, but we don't want for our children to get over in there because once you're in the prison system, you're a slave. You know, you really are. I mean, Antoine, I'm using those words that Antoine used. Once you're over there, everybody is. And so, yes, you want to act, you want to behave. We want to, and then you're completely shut down. And then when you get out, then you have to kind of relearn how to become yourself again. And there's a lot of wounded people walking around that have been in prison that have had to shut themselves so down, so tight. The question is this benefiting our society? But I want to get these questions in because there's some really good ones. First one is, what about criminalization of Black, Brown, Indigenous, and other kids of color as a strategy, and the strategy was underlined, as a strategy of othering and dehumanization, not justice, inequitable treatment conditions. So what about the criminalization of Black, Brown, Indigenous kids of color as a strategy, like the system is putting it out as a strategy? Any comments on this question?
Go ahead.
I think that is, I think that's very true. But I think the The hard thing, that doesn't sit right with me because, again, it places our own understanding into the hands of those that have been controlling our fate. When we are never told or never taught that we are not criminals, that we are brilliant and we're beautiful and we're businessmen and women, like we can't easily be swayed as being called a thug or a criminal or a gangbanger. Are you from the hood? Right? So I understand that that is a strategy, but to counter that, again, the responsibility will always fall back on us. We have to tell our children, you beautiful, you matter. Do you realize you are a descendant of a powerful person? So when they step outside more as themselves. And the one thing I tell my mother, I tell my child, like my duty as her father is to teach her how to be an adult. Parents' jobs are to protect, to teach and educate, but to teach our children how to navigate this world when we're no longer in it. And if my son and if my daughter don't realize that they are descendants of great people, they believe it when somebody say, you ain't nothing but a screw up. They internalize it because they have nothing to combat that. So if it's black or brown, if it's indigenous people, it's a people that haven't known for a fact who they are. So it's easier to label. It's easier to accept any definition that is thrown your way. So I do understand that that's a strategy, but I got a strategy greater than that.
All right, thank you. Anybody else talking about strategy?
There was a strategy. I mean, Nixon talked about it, okay? The reality is there was a strategy. There was a strategy to infiltrate the African American community in a certain way, whether it was the crack epidemic or other things. They admitted it. They knew what they were doing, okay? The reality faces us here. There was people talk about law enforcement using Marin City as a training ground. Why use Marin City as a training ground? Well, you know, there's a lot of criminals down there. Wait a minute, I got the crime statistics. Marin City's crime statistics aren't outrageous in such a way that you can use them, but it's that strategy of fear, and the criminal justice system is based on fear in a lot of ways. And so some of the things that we're talking about and disrupting the pipeline down the way, you're right, we don't want them my way. If there's ways that we can keep them here, and I think one of the things that I'm learning more and more about, and every day we have these conversations, we learn about different things like code switching. I only recently learned about the very reality that a lot of people of color and indigenous people have to live through to code switch, to act, a certain way with white folks and then be able to be themselves in their own community. This code switching that goes back and forth, right? And in communities of privilege, you don't have to code switch in a lot of ways because it's basically a privileged club that you get to act in a certain way. And so a lot of the things that you talk about, navigation, are incredibly complex for young children. And one of the things that we sometimes don't do is we're not as clear with our children as we should be about how to navigate. When I talk politeness is power, that's a navigation system. When I talk about patience is power, that's a navigation system. And so how is it that we teach navigational skills early on to teach the very thing our children are going to be able to do, to be able to believe they're beautiful, to be able to believe they're brilliant? They need resiliency because they get beat up every day, every single day. And it's that cover of resiliency that if we can use the school to build that, they won't come to me, okay? And I'm going to tell you one other thing. They aren't coming to me. Crime is down in America. Okay? You wouldn't believe it if you read the newspaper. The violent crime is down, okay? You look at the numbers that go to prison out of Marin County, they are down. The reality is we continue to live in that world of fear that Antoine states, and if that paradigm continues, we cannot get to the solutions that are based on that beautiful and brilliant. a statement that Antoine made.
And Jose, and I appreciate that statistic, and this has just been my observation too. The statistics are down, and yet there's so many generations now that are locked up and that have been locked up. So it's almost like we've squeezed it in. There's not as many people left to lock up anymore. I mean, that's kind of what I'm seeing as a reality. There's not as many people to lock up, and there's been such damage intergenerationally going on as well. So yes, and I do feel that crime is down, but crime was also down, before the crack epidemic as well. And yet there was this, again, strategy speaking along those lines. So I think that we have to look at, you said this about the liquid community. Kids that live here in Marin City also have family enrichment in Vallejo, and so kind of looking at what their lockup rates are, because as black communities and brown communities of color become more gentrified, and people are having to just move all over the place, I think it's important for us to look, we're going to have to expand who we are as localities, not be as tribal, like I'm from Marin City or I'm from Richmond, I'm from Vallejo. People are having to move all over the place. So yeah, but I hear you. Crime is down. We get that. We don't want to keep people being criminalized when they come out.
One of the things I hope happens is Antoine and a lot of the people like Oscar and Antoine who have been through the system, we need them to give us legislation that they would like to see change. Because right now, we are seeing criminal reform happen at a great pace. And some of the ideas, people with prior felonies now can be on juries. All kinds of things that are starting to happen. The more that we can, mine from their experiences, the changes we need to make, this is the time to make them and solidify them so that we can change culture for the next generation.
And that's why we're doing this panel. So Dr. Garcia, do you have anything that you want to say on the strategy?
I just would add on to what these brothers both said. Self-esteem is everything. Self-esteem is the armor that allows you not to be defined by your trauma. Really teaching kids pride of place, making sure that they're represented, that our communities are represented in the institutions and systems in which they work. Things like ethnic studies, things like critical literacy. These are all navigational tools, right? That allow our students to have the chance to show up and be their authentic selves, and yet still navigate the larger system in which we're all nested in, right? The ability to really understand concepts like intersectionality and systems of oppression, and how, race is one thing, class is another, immigration status, language, these things all add up to these interinstitutional dynamics. And unless you can see them and identify them and understand what they are and how they work, you have little chance to not be consumed by them.
That's great. So the next question comes from a 13-year-old girl. Thank you, Colette. Why, and it's a multi-part question, so listen carefully and you can answer whichever part you want. Why do you think that 18% of preschoolers are black, but black children make up 50% of preschool suspensions? Do you think we have made enough progress for racial equality since the Civil War? If people in prison can't vote, then do you think that the criminal justice system is taking away our democracy? From the mouths of babes.
I'll go in order. A lot of what we talked about already: deficit thinking, low expectations, different standards, different access to pre-K is a big factor. No, we haven't actually made that much progress. Maybe since the Civil War, but not since the Civil Rights Movement for sure. I don't feel like we've made that much progress. And what was the last question? Yes.
About if people in prison can't vote, do you think that the criminal justice system is taking away our democracy?
Yes, it is purposeful to purge more Black and Latino voters from the rolls. You can look at it systematically in many states.
You know, in California, you can vote as long as you're not in prison. That is to say, in prison. But if you're on probation in county jail, you can vote. I would love to see a judge make a condition of probation that people register to vote. Now, all of a sudden, you know, you start saying, well, wow, yeah, that's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about thinking outside of these boxes. I think she's absolutely right. Can you imagine if every person in state prison was allowed to register to vote and people had to lobby for their votes? All of a sudden, my God, God bless her, tell her to keep dreaming. I mean, I think it's just wonderful that she has the insight at 13 to be able to think of such nice structural ways to bring equality.
Well, yeah, younger. Any other comments? I want to, because these are great. I can tell that the audience that's here is really thinking deeply, and I want to get to some of these questions. So, any comments on any of her thoughts before we move on?
I want to comment real quick because I think like that question is a direct result of how young you can be encouraged to do critical thinking, right? Like this is a person who sees the world critically, right? And that kind of thinking exists in the minds of almost every 13-year-old. That is the reflection of our youth, not the way we see our youth, right? It's like thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Frank, I want to bring Frank up because he had something to say. Is Frank still in the room? Where'd he go? Yeah, didn't you? Frank, did you want to come up? I thought someone wanted to come up. Okay, I thought Frank wanted to come up.
You know, I was getting ready to depart and
do you want to ask a question, Sharika?
You know, I was actually talking to this phenomenal man. I just wanted to say very quickly and just beckoning us to collectively think. When you deal with medical insurance, it's dear to be proactive, to screen for things prior to them culminating. And the prisons, we can have chaplaincy, we can have one-on-one with parole officers in order to rehabilitate. But in the schools, they're void of these components that actually allows us to be proactive and the cultivation of the innate gifts that dwells in children. And when you deal with education, hope of knowing that I was born with profuse gifts and I'm being channeled to walk in my gifts can bring me so much joy and so much purpose that I'm not inclined to engage in things that manifest me going into prison. When you deal with school while we're getting educated, kids dwell oblivious to their gifts. Over and beyond that scope, when you deal with children who are Black and brown, having to adhere to the philosophy of being African American in one context, and then going to a different philosophy, it creates cognitive dissonance, which is a foundation for psychological and mental disorders. Over and beyond that scope, you have the implications of groupthink and other social dynamics also playing an equation. So I'm just putting forth the suggestion for us to really consider the possibility of promulgating things that will allow for divine energies to enter our schools with some form of spiritual divine energy direction where kids are walking in their purpose and filled with hope and cognizant at an early age that they can do something and be something, and that will inevitably disrupt and transform this system. Phenomenal job, you all.
Thank you, Sharika. And Sharika is the mother of a 6-year-old son who's going to Manor School and is, one of the only few chocolate children at the school, and she is really on top of them at that school. So thank you, Sharika. Okay, specific research on the school-to-prison pipeline for girls has revealed a sexual abuse to prison pipeline, trauma to prison pipeline. Any comments on this prison pipeline, sex abuse pipeline to prison?
I mean, I kind of referenced it earlier with the suspension statistic, but this is another intersection. This is why we got to look at human trafficking. This is why we got to look at consent education in schools at a young age. All of these things traumatize our young women, and traumatized people often then don't know how to process their trauma. You know, one of the things we do here is practice mindfulness. It's not just to create a calm or a peaceful school. It's actually to give people a tool to process their trauma. We have to start, as Sharika just mentioned, really proactively giving people tools so that they actually don't be defined by their trauma, that they can transcend their trauma. And I think that sexual abuse of young women, but also of young men, creates a tremendous amount of hurt that many people are just not able to overcome.
One of the things that is real here is the reality of children in crowded conditions, in transitory housing, right? Young girls that live with one family, another family, or a lot of people live in an apartment together, and young girls are, oftentimes, I've talked to several young girls who were drinking very early in the morning, and I thought, what's this all about? Until come to find out that the child was scared to death because she literally couldn't go to the bathroom at night because she was scared somebody was going to grab her. And all these fear factors led her to basically come into the juvenile system because of all of these fears. And you knew somehow that there was that process. In representing women throughout my career, one of the things that I found is sexual abuse eventually led to massive self-medication. Whether it's drugs, whether it's stealing, whether it's check-kiting, whether it's, you name it, getting involved in that. And that eventually was their prison pipeline. From sexual abuse to a mechanism for supporting a habit or some way like that. And so that question really gets to the heart of that underlying trauma that causes a pipeline for women.
Okay, as we move on.
Maybe we're not qualified to answer that question too on one noticing.
Yeah. Well, yeah, if you want to comment on it. So we're into like our last 15 minutes, and I think we will be able to get through some questions. So I would just say if the question really moves you, please answer it. This was several questions. I'm going to pull out one from this particular person. Considering the fact that America's legacy of racism is embedded into the PK to 12 educational system, what aspect of schooling needs to be addressed first in order to promote equity? And that might be a question for Dr. Garcia.
Yeah, I don't know that it's one. I think this is a case where we might be kind of this is a case where linear thinking might not really help us. One thing that I know to be true is if kids and families don't feel safe at a school, you can't do anything else, right? And so school climate and culture is critical, but at the same time, you need to work on teacher perception of students and school perception of families. And so I just would like to offer, maybe it's not linear, maybe it's multiple points of entry.
And here's a comment that it's not a question, so I'm just going to read it because someone did have it as a comment. Regarding what Antoine said about teaching kids laws, also important to teach kids about their rights. All parents should feel welcome in their child's school. So whoever wrote that is feeling that, they're not always welcome in their child's school. Yes, another question. Okay. Okay. All right. Segregation, integration. What have black folks gained from integration? Possibly segregation is best for black folks, especially for educational purposes? Question mark? Is that a topic? Anybody wants to jump on? Segregation, are we better since Brown versus Board of Education? We know Plessy versus Ferguson, we didn't have the monies, but there was a different kind of outcome.
So that's a really interesting question. The number of black teachers and principals was decimated after desegregation. Black teachers and principals were not allowed to continue in the profession. Also as part of what happened, why we have such a predominantly white workforce in education. Arguably, opportunities and outcomes were comparable, if not better, segregated schools. And so it's a really tough question in a lot of ways. But I also think that, we actually see hypersegregation again in a lot of schools, right? Our school district is under a desegregation order, the first one in 50 years in the state of California. But you can look all over the Bay Area, Oakland, Hayward, San Francisco, and you'll see schools that are 98% Black and Latino. And kids are not doing very well in those schools. And so, it's a different world, it's a different society, it's a different time. It might be a little bit of an apples to oranges comparison. What I do think is really valid is having high numbers of teachers of color, and again, going back to this idea of affirming and validating education. White kids do better with teachers of color, right? Teachers of color are an important component of our educational system, and we don't do enough to recruit and retain and sustain teachers of color, and that's how I'd like to answer that question.
Anybody else feeling like that's drawing them? Integration, segregation, are we better off?
A few years ago, a retired probation officer that some of you guys may know, Lonnie Morris, ran a program where he took kids from Marin City and also from Richmond to traditionally Black colleges, to tour them, to possibly, enroll there. And what a lot of these kids came back and said was, it was so wonderful to see Black PhDs. It was so wonderful to see Black professors. It was so wonderful to walk into a classroom where they felt safe. And so when my instinct and the way I was raised was segregation was bad. But now I'm starting, I don't know how to define what brings safety to a classroom. And I think that if you look at it as what does it make people safe to learn, I leave it at that in discussing that question. Where a person feels safest and feels the ability to be able to achieve, I think that's the answer.
I have to say, I'm not going to answer with we were either better off either way, because to do so for me would be able to say that I can learn everything I need to learn from my own people. And that's just my perspective. But desegregation, the problems with it didn't come from the Black community. When young African American children were welcomed, they were welcomed as if they were animals. So that desegregation was a point in time where society had to look at themselves. If you've never had to face a problem, you don't know what the hell is wrong with you. So, are we better as a community and a culture? That can go either way. But do we have a better understanding of what needs to be addressed? Yes. Because if you think I am what's wrong with your world, you have a long way to go. And if I think you are what's wrong with my world, I'm not looking at the right problems. My focus is somewhere else. So,
thank you. Thank you for those answers. Yes. Okay, so along those same lines, referring to that 80% of public school teachers who are white women, how many are receiving cultural education? This is a Dr. Garcia question, from the communities they teach in, and how can whites support the needs, the changes, more people of color being teachers, addressing trauma, etc.? How can whites support the need for changes for teachers of color?
Here, teachers are getting training. In our district, Sam Union High School District, teachers are getting training. But again, I think it really goes back to how you're organizing, what kind of candidates you're supporting, who you're electing to decision making on places like the school board or city council, or how you vote to support school construction bonds or teacher housing or all of those things. These are all actually civic actions that we can take. you know, and how often do you talk to your neighbors about these kind of questions? You know, we have reached a stage where, you know, black and brown people can try to educate white people for, you know, eternity. And at the end of the day, white people need to do more educating of white people than black and brown people.
Okay, word up. Okay, so these next questions are specifically for Dr. Garcia. You can continue, and for Antoine. So Antoine, I'll start with you. Antoine, can you talk about how restorative justice programs that you're doing, that you help, and others that you help run? Because you're doing restorative justice.
The restorative justice practice is a phenomenal outlook on life. It takes the position of healing when it comes to accountability. The restorative justice practice is you given the opportunity for the survivor or the victim of a crime to have input on what they believe is right and wrong and what should happen to the person that has either caused harm or is the offender. Because so much about the justice system strips that power away. You don't come to court till I tell you come to court. You can't speak to him. You can't say sorry. Like, there is no communication, so there's so much that gets unanswered. And sometimes people just want to know why. As a survivor of many of crimes, the one question has always been, why me? And those answers can sometimes bring healing. So if it's a school, if it's in your household, punishment, right, isn't going to always be the best way to bring people together and to make something grow. It's figuring out what the survivor or the victim needs in order to heal. And maybe that is counseling, maybe that is a face-to-face, like maybe it is a community building, and that can sometimes be the thing to make a person reestablish who they are. Because we can get lost in society. We can get lost, and that can sometimes be the thing that grounds people. And it's saying, I should never hurt somebody. I would have never thought me breaking into your car would cause you many nights of not being able to sleep. I am so sorry. So the restorative justice practice, it puts voices back into those that have actually been harmed and has caused harm. And this is another thing that has been like incorporated in a bunch of schools, especially nowadays, but it needs to continue to happen in the household and in the communities.
Yeah, and I just want to add on to that, you know, RJ actually comes from First Nations tribal courts in Canada, and it made its way into the criminal justice system in this country because some reservations span the international boundary between Canada and the United States of America. And, you know, in terms of application, I think it's really important to ground it in the idea that this was the way that Native Americans as a community looked at making things whole. And so one of my favorite aspects of it is really the community aspect, right? And yes, it's the survivor, and yes, it's the person that did harm, but often there are other members of the community involved in the decision. And when we're talking about restoration, oftentimes we're talking about restoration to the whole community, right? Because our actions extend beyond what is an individual. And so if you intersect that with the work that we're doing on school climate, then instead of a matrix of consequences for behaviors, you have a matrix of restorative practices, matrix of community service, matrix of community circles, and that kind of thing. And I know you probably got some things to say about that too.
Well, those were specific, because we only have a few minutes and we only have a few more questions, and I do want to get to them. So, Dr. Garcia, this is specifically from you. Can you talk about, briefly, the segregation problem in Sausalito and Marin City and the unification process? I know it's a lot, but can you, for the audience, anybody that doesn't know about it, can you briefly?
Yeah, I don't know how. Yeah, I'll try.
Yeah, that's a big question.
Yeah. So I mean, one of the things I'd say is it's a decades-old problem, right? It it precedes probably most of us sitting in this room, although some of us have been a part of other desegregation efforts in this community. It has to do with all the structural issues that we talked about, housing and economics and all these other things. Has to do with an actual freeway that was built through the middle of a community that physically separated this community. It has to do with the school to prison pipeline and the criminal justice system and negative perceptions of the historically black community in our county. And it has to do with economics, and it has to do with things like white flight. And in a nutshell, there's a great video on the Sausalito Marin City School District website under the Unification tab that's called Unification Desegregation, made by some Tam High students, shout out Tam High, that kind of breaks down what happened and how we got here. But, basically there was funneling of resources to the charter school, which really destabilized our traditional public school, and really supported that segregation, made a lot of families not look at our public school as a viable option, right? If you don't have single subject credentialed teachers, and you don't have PE, and you don't have art, and you don't have music, which school would you send your kids to? And so we are working together voluntarily to unify the two schools. There's been a tremendous amount of progress. I see some people in this room that are part of it. Literally dozens of people have been working on a unification plan. And I'm happy to report that we're probably about 6 to 8 weeks away from making that public. And if we can figure out how to unify our two schools and this community, we will immediately be in compliance with the desegregation order from the State Attorney General.
Great, thank you. Thank you. So before I go on to the very last question, I will say that last comment was the segregation problem in Sausalito, Marin City. I grew up in this community in Marin City. Third generation here, it was 99% African American. I guess some people would say that was segregated, but it was the most amazing thing. I already was in Marin County, so I knew what it was to be the only black person in spaces all the time. But I tell you, it was such a blessing for me to come home and be around my family and people who'd known my family for a long time. So segregation sometimes looks like a problem from the outside, but it's not necessarily always a problem. So I just had to interject that. This last question is, how does the school to prison pipeline reinforce white superiority and privilege?
Easy. When we think about privilege, we should think about privilege as the opposite of oppression. Right? Like, this isn't you haven't had to work for anything. To not conceptualize privilege as that, just the opposite of oppression. And the school to prison pipeline is proof that it has for so long been specific communities that have been targeted for reasons that honestly, it's just it's like God's knowledge. It's like we really can't specifically say this is why, but the school to prison pipeline reinforces that, because again, from generation to generation, it's proof of, you see, they're criminals. They keep going to jail. If you break the law, you go to jail. You see, we don't break the law, so this doesn't happen. And it just gets passed from mother to father and father to mother and child to siblings to cousins to new babies of this is what you don't do. And this is how all communities are system impacted. Because if you watch something happen on TV, you take a position. And if your child is in earshot of you saying, see, that's why you can't trust them. Your children take that, they soak it up. And now they have a mindset and they have a way of viewing people. And even on the opposite end, when you have people in my community saying, see, can't trust the police. And now my child grows up thinking, I can't trust officials. So it doesn't, ground zero isn't always just going to be the community that is impacted. It may be impacted the most, But system impacted communities are all of our communities. So the school to prison pipeline, it keeps that same narrative of a certain kind of people come from a certain kind of place, will live a certain kind of life, and this is what they deserve. And that is always going to be superiority because it's not us. You see, it's not us.
I taught high school. I taught high school at Chaminade College Prep in Southern California, and I taught high school at St. Mary's College High School across in the East Bay. The way to understand the school to prison pipeline is to also understand the school to Princeton pipeline, okay? When you see what real privilege looks like, when you see that, you can make the comparison, you know? And it is that world that is so accessible, that is so privileged, you know? And one of the heartaches that happened at St. Mary's College High School is that it went coeducational, because for many years, it was the finishing school for African American men. It was a single gender school, and literally we were funneling young, talented African American young people to Princeton. But all of a sudden, when it became coeducational and all kinds of stuff, we lost that ability to that pipeline. And the reality is that those pipelines exist, and it's only when you get introduced to them that you realize the real sadness of the school to prison pipeline. It really is a terrible thing to have to witness. And the goal really is to sit down there and say, how is it that we create a pipeline that doesn't lead to prison, and it gives some of the hope that we're trying to engender here.
As one of the most successful black men that I grew up with in this community, the homie Zaire said to me recently, if they can define me, they can confine me.
Whoa, okay. So, thank you so much. I want to thank the Dr. Okay, Frank. Okay, well, before you come up and exit everyone, I just want to thank you, the audience, for being a part of this important conversation, really. And, you know, most importantly, thank you, Antoine. Thank you, Dr. G. Thank you, Jose, for being here.
And let's thank Oshala and the whole panel.
This is not just a conversation. This is not just a conversation. When I opened up and talking about the people that are in prison right now, that are dealing with this right now, our brother Lumumba, one of our brilliant artists in our artist collective, was in for 48 years. He just got out. First apartment at the age of 60. He's working 2 jobs now. Come out and see all these people in tents. Like, what happened out here while I was gone? These are the realities people are living in every day. So what I would piggyback on our distinguished panel has begun to say is that, you know, wanting to help, like really looking at what's going on with what you're not seeing. And just look at that and see where the leaders are of those people. Because there's leaders, those prisoners were on strike. I mean, can you imagine going on strike in prison? How do you do that? And yet they did. And that's the reality of what's going on. That is one way to help disrupt the system too, is to begin to empower the voices that are not being heard. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. I'd like to also recognize Driver's Market for the food that was brought in. The MLK Academy for giving us this space to use to have this forum. And thank you all for the interest that brought you out this evening. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.